He walked into the most exclusive gala in Manhattan with a woman on his arm who definitely wasn't his wife, convinced the world belonged to him. Sterling Hayes thought he had committed the perfect crime, stealing his wife's fortune, erasing her legacy, and replacing her with a younger model in front of the city's elite. But arrogance has a funny way of blinding you to the guillotine hanging right above your neck. When the auctioneer slammed that gavel and read the name on the deed, the room didn't just go silent. It stopped breathing. What happens when the man who thinks he's the hunter realizes he's actually the prey? You won't believe how this ends. The humidity of a New York July had finally broken, leaving behind a crisp, electric evening perfect for the kind of money that was about to change hands. The DuPont Charity Gala was not merely a party. It was a blood sport dressed up in silk and diamonds, held in the grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel. The air smelled of expensive lilies, chilled vintage champagne, and the sharp, metallic tang of ambition. Sterling Hayes adjusted his cufflinks, platinum, encrusted with sapphire, and checked his reflection in the darkened window of the limousine before the valet opened the door. At 45, Sterling was the picture of American corporate royalty. He had the jawline of a news anchor and the eyes of a shark. He was the CEO of Hayes Harrington Global, a logistics and shipping empire that moved half the world's grain and a significant portion of its oil. But tonight, the whispers weren't about his stock portfolio. They were about the woman sitting next to him. "Ready, darling?" Sterling asked, his voice smooth, devoid of any guilt. Sienna Blake smiled, and it was a weaponized expression. She was 24, sharp as a tack, and wearing a dress the color of fresh arterial blood. It was a custom Oscar de la Renta, backless and daring, designed to scream one thing: I am here, and I am not hiding. "I was born ready, Sterling," she purred, threading her arm through his. "Are you sure she's not coming?" Sterling laughed, a dry, dismissive sound. "Madeline. Please. She's in the Hamptons nursing a migraine and knitting or whatever it is she does to waste time. She hates these events. She hasn't set foot in the plaza since her father died. Tonight is ours, Sienna. Tonight we stop pretending." The door opened. Flashbulbs erupted like a lightning storm. Sterling stepped out, pulling Sienna with him. Usually a man in his position would be discreet about a mistress. But Sterling was past discretion. He was in the burn the bridges phase of his exit strategy. His lawyers had assured him the prenuptial loopholes were tight. He had moved the assets. He had isolated Madeline. In his mind, the divorce was a formality. The war was already won. He was just taking a victory lap before the enemy even knew the battle had started. As they walked up the red carpet, the murmurs began. That's not Madeline. Who is she? Look at that dress. The audacity. Does he think we're blind?" Sterling soaked it in. He nodded to Thomas Archibald, the banking tycoon, and winked at Senator Collins. He was introducing Sienna not as an assistant, but as a peer, a partner. "Sterling," a voice boomed near the entrance. It was Gregor Ivanovich, a Russian oil magnate with a handshake that could crush walnuts. "I did not expect to see you so accompanied." Gregor's eyes darted to Sienna, then back to Sterling, his eyebrows raised in silent judgment. "Gregor, good to see you," Sterling said, clapping the man on the shoulder. "Allow me to introduce Sienna Blake. She's going to be heading up our new PR division. And she's my personal guest tonight." The implication hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. "Charmed," Sienna said, extending a hand dripping with diamonds. Diamonds that looked suspiciously similar to a set Madeline's grandmother had owned. Gregor kissed her hand, but gave Sterling a look that said, "You are playing a dangerous game, friend." And Madeline? She is well. She's retiring. Sterling said the lie tasting sweet on his tongue. She's stepping back from public life entirely. It's better for her health. They moved into the ballroom, a sea of tuxedos and gowns. Sterling felt invincible. He had brought his mistress into the lion's den, and nobody had bitten him. He guided Sienna toward the front to table 1, the table usually reserved for the biggest donors. He didn't notice the waiter lingering too long near his elbow. He didn't notice the way the event coordinator, a woman named Beatrice, tapped her earpiece and whispered something urgent the moment she saw him. He only saw the prize. He was going to announce the merger tonight. He was going to introduce Sienna. And he was going to bid on the auction's centerpiece, the Star of Andalusia, a 40-carat emerald, and put it around Sienna's neck, finalizing the humiliation of his soon-to-be ex-wife. "Champagne," Sterling offered, grabbing a flute. Sienna took it, her eyes scanning the room. "They're all looking at us, Sterling." "Let them look," he whispered, leaning into her ear. "By tomorrow morning, the papers will say, 'You're the new Queen of New York.' Madeline is the past. You are the future." He took a sip, the bubbles crisp and cold. He had no idea that the champagne was the last pleasant thing he would taste for a very, very long time. To understand why Sterling Hayes was so confident, you have to understand the marriage. Or rather, what Sterling thought the marriage was. He had married Madeline Harrington 15 years ago. At the time, she was the shy, stuttering daughter of Old Man Harrington, the shipping tycoon. Sterling was the aggressive young executive from Chicago, with a chip on his shoulder and a hunger that scared people. Harrington had seen Sterling's drive and thought, he can protect her. When the old man died, he left everything to Madeline. But Madeline, grief-stricken and overwhelmed by the boardroom sharks, had handed the reins to Sterling. "You do it, Sterling," she had said, her voice trembling, sitting in the oversized leather chair in her father's study. "I don't understand the numbers. I just want to support the charities. You run the business." And he had. For 15 years he ran it. And for the last 5, he had been robbing it blind. He viewed Madeline as a piece of furniture, a soft, compliant, boring woman who spent her days gardening at their estate in Connecticut or attending silent retreats. She never asked about the offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. She never questioned why the dividends were lower this quarter. She never looked at the bank statements. Or so he thought. 3 days before the Gala, Sterling had sat in his office on the top floor of the Harrington Tower, looking at the divorce papers his lawyer, a man named Clinton Vane, had drafted. "It's brutal, Sterling," Clinton had warned, tapping the document. "You're effectively leaving her with the Connecticut house and a stipend. You're taking the company, the liquid assets, the London flat, and the jet. If she gets a forensic accountant—" "She won't," Sterling had interrupted, spinning a pen in his fingers. "Madeline trusts me implicitly. I'll tell her the company is in debt, that I'm saving her from bankruptcy by taking the liabilities. She'll sign whatever I put in front of her to avoid a conflict. She hates conflict." "And the girl?" Clinton asked, referring to Sienna. "If Madeline finds out about Sienna before the ink is dry—" "Madeline is in the Hamptons with no Wi-Fi," Sterling scoffed. "She thinks I'm working late. By the time she finds out, I'll own the board, and she'll be history." Back in the ballroom, Sterling placed a hand on Sienna's lower back as they mingled. The adrenaline was intoxicating. He saw his competitors, men who had looked down on him when he was just a son-in-law, now looking at him with a mix of envy and respect. He was shedding the Harrington leash. He was just Sterling Hayes now. "Sterling, darling," a voice grated. It was Mrs. Vanderwall, the doyenne of New York society. She was 80, wore purple velvet, and had a tongue like a rasp. She peered at Sienna through a lorgnette. "I don't believe we've been introduced." "Sienna Blake," Sienna said, projecting confidence she didn't quite feel under the old woman's gaze. "Blake," Mrs. Vanderwall mused. "I don't know the family. And where is dear Madeline? I specifically hoped to thank her for the donation to the botanical gardens." "Madeline is unwell," Sterling cut in smoothly. "She sends her regrets." Mrs. Vanderwall hummed a low, vibrating sound. "Unwell. Yes. There seems to be a lot of that going around among wives whose husbands have new assistants." She turned and walked away before Sterling could retort. "Old hag," Sienna muttered. "Ignore her," Sterling said, tightening his grip on her arm. "She's irrelevant. Look, the auction is starting." The lights in the ballroom dimmed. A spotlight hit the stage. A man walked out to the podium. It was Graham Norton, no relation to the talk show host, but equally charismatic, the most famous auctioneer in London, flown in specifically for this event. "Ladies and gentlemen," Graham's voice boomed, amplified by the speakers. "Welcome to the annual DuPont Charity Gala. Tonight we are raising money for the children's wing of Mount Sinai. But tonight is also a night of surprises." Sterling smirked. He checked his phone. A text from his CFO. "The transfer is complete. The Harrington shares are in your private holding company. It's done." He let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. He had done it. He had officially stolen the company out from under his wife. He was free. "And to kick off the evening," Graham continued, "we have a very special opening message. Usually the chairwoman of the Harrington Group gives the opening toast. Sadly, Mrs. Madeline Hayes is not on the stage tonight." Sterling raised his glass to Sienna. "Here we go. The official excuse." "However," Graham said, pausing for effect, "she has sent a video message to welcome you all." Sterling froze. The glass stopped halfway to his lips. Video message. She was supposed to be in bed with a migraine. She hadn't mentioned a video. A massive screen descended from the ceiling behind the stage. The projector whirred to life. "Relax," Sienna whispered, seeing the tension in his jaw. "It's probably just a pre-recorded hello send money thing. She's too polite to do anything else." Sterling nodded, but a cold prickle of sweat broke out on the back of his neck. He watched the screen. The image flickered, and then Madeline's face appeared. She was sitting in the sunroom of their Connecticut estate. She looked pale, wearing a modest beige cardigan. Her hair was pulled back. She looked exactly as Sterling described her, meek, tired, harmless. "Good evening, everyone," the video Madeline said softly. Her voice was shaky. "I am so sorry I cannot be there in person. As my husband Sterling has probably told you, I have been unwell." Sterling exhaled. "Good. She's sticking to the script." "But," video Madeline continued, and for a split second, she looked directly into the camera lens, her eyes hardening in a way Sterling had never seen before. "Illness gives one a lot of time to think, and to review paperwork." The room went quiet. The clinking of silverware stopped. "I hope you bid generously tonight," Madeline said, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "Especially on the final item. It is very close to my heart. Have a wonderful evening. And Sterling." The camera zoomed in slightly. Make sure you get the receipt. The screen went black. The applause was polite but confused. A ripple of unease went through the room. What was that? Sienna hissed. What paperwork? Nothing. Sterling snapped, though his heart was hammering against his ribs. She's rambling. It's the medication. Forget it. But he couldn't forget it. The tone of her voice. The receipt. And now, Graham the auctioneer shouted, bringing the energy back up. Let's get to the bidding item number 1, a week in a private villa in Tuscany. Sterling downed his champagne in one gulp. He needed to get through this night. He just needed to buy the emerald flaunt Sienna and get home to ensure Madeline hadn't done anything stupid. He didn't know that the doors at the back of the ballroom had just been locked from the outside. And he certainly didn't know that the final item Madeline mentioned wasn't jewelry. The gala dinner was served with the precision of a military operation. Waiters in white gloves moved in unison, placing plates of seared scallops and truffle risotto in front of the guests. But at table 1, the appetite had vanished. Sterling Hayes sat rigidly, his fork hovering over his plate. The video message from Madeline had rattled him more than he cared to admit. The receipt. What did she mean? It was a common phrase, sure, but the way she said it with that faint, icy smile felt specific. It felt targeted. Are you going to eat? Sienna asked, her voice tight. She had noticed the shift in the room. People were whispering, not the admiring whispers from the red carpet, but the shielded behind-the-hand whispers that signaled a scandal in progress. I'm not hungry, Sterling snapped. He reached for his wine glass only to find it empty. He signaled a waiter. Another bottle, the 96 Bollinger. Put it on my tab. The waiter, a young man with a nervous demeanor, hesitated. Sir, I can't. Sterling turned slowly, his eyes narrowing. Excuse me. The bar manager. He ran your card, Mr. Hayes. For the previous round. The waiter stammered, dropping his voice so the surrounding billionaires wouldn't hear. It was declined. Code 05. Do not honor. Sterling felt the blood rush to his face. That's absurd. It's a black Amex. It doesn't have a limit. I'm sure it's just a bank error, sir. The system is probably overwhelmed. The waiter said, quickly terrified of the man who could undoubtedly have him fired. But for the vintage bottles, we need a pre-authorization. Here, Sterling growled, pulling a sleek metal card from his jacket, the corporate card for Hayes Harrington Global. Use this one, and bring 2 bottles. The waiter took it and scurried away. Declined, Sienna hissed, leaning in. Sterling, tell me you didn't max out your cards buying me the condo. Don't be stupid, Sienna, Sterling hissed back, straightening his tie. It's a security hold. I moved $14 million into the holding company yesterday. The bank's fraud algorithms are just twitchy. Everything is fine. But everything was not fine. Across the room at table 4, Sterling locked eyes with Sebastian Cross. Sebastian was a corporate raider, a man Sterling had screwed over in a port deal in Rotterdam 3 years ago. Sebastian raised his glass to Sterling, a predatory grin stretching across his face. Why was Sebastian smiling? And why was he talking to the frantic-looking man who had just walked in? Sterling's own chief legal officer. Clinton Vane. Clinton wasn't supposed to be here. He was supposed to be in the office shredding the last of the physical files regarding the offshore transfers. Sterling pulled out his phone. No signal. What the hell? Sterling muttered, tapping the screen. The Plaza Ballroom usually had excellent reception. He checked the Wi-Fi. Nothing. It was as if a digital Faraday cage had been dropped over table 1. Ladies and gentlemen, Graham the auctioneer's voice boomed again, cutting through Sterling's rising panic. "We are moving to the high-stakes portion of the evening. I hope you have your paddles ready." The first few items went by in a blur. A vintage Ferrari sold for $2.4 million to the Russian Gregshaw. A walk-on role in the next Scorsese film went for $800,000. Sterling sat on his hands, waiting. He needed to make a statement. He needed to win the emerald. The Star of Andalusia was the crown jewel of the night. Buying it for Sienna was the ultimate power move. It showed liquid cash dominance and a complete disregard for his wife's feelings. And now, Graham announced, the lights dimming to a spotlight on a velvet cushion. Lot number 25, the Star of Andalusia, a 40-carat uncut Colombian emerald set in platinum. The crowd gasped. It was magnificent. It glowed with a deep, verdant fire. "Bidding starts at $1 million, Graham said. $1 million, Sterling said, loudly raising his paddle. He didn't wait for the preamble. "We have $1 million from Mr. Hayes," Graham said. "Do I hear 1.5? 1.5, Sebastian Cross called out from table 4. Sterling glared at him. $2 million. 2.5, Sebastian countered instantly. $3 million, Sterling barked. Sienna gripped his thigh, her nails digging in. This was it. The adrenaline washed away the anxiety about the credit card. This war combat. 3.5, Sebastian said, looking bored. 4 million, Sterling shouted. The room was buzzing. This was well above the estimated value. This was an ego war. 4.5, Sebastian Holt said, checking his watch. Sterling hesitated. $4.5 million was a lot of liquid cash even for him. But he couldn't lose to Sebastian Cross. Not tonight. Not with Sienna watching. Not with the whispers. $5 million, Sterling said, his voice echoing in the silent ballroom. Graham looked around. $5 million to Mr. Hayes. Going once? Sebastian Cross picked up his napkin, dabbed his mouth, and set his paddle down. He smiled at Sterling. It was a pitying smile. Going twice. Sterling felt a surge of triumph. He had won. Sold to Mr. Sterling Hayes for $5 million. Graham slammed the gavel down. Applause erupted. Sienna squealed and kissed him on the cheek, leaving a smudge of red lipstick. Oh my God, Sterling. It's beautiful. Sterling stood up, buttoning his jacket, ready to walk to the stage to claim his prize and make the customary speech. He felt the master of the universe again. The credit card decline was a glitch. Clinton Vane, crashing the party, was probably just to congratulate him. He was untouchable. He took 2 steps towards the stage. "1 moment, please." Graham's voice cut through the applause like a knife. It wasn't the celebratory tone of an auctioneer anymore. It was sharp, authoritative. Sterling stopped. "What is it I'm coming up to sign?" "Please remain at your table, Mr. Hayes," Graham said into the microphone. The room went deathly quiet. The feedback from the speakers whined slightly. "We have a slight administrative complication regarding Lot 25. "What complication?" Sterling demanded, his voice carrying without the mic. "I have the money." "Actually," Graham said, looking at a tablet that had just been handed to him by a woman in a severe grey suit. Madeline's personal attorney, a shark named Beatrice Thorne. No relation to the forbidden list names. Let's use Beatrice Kerr. "The complication is regarding the authorization of the funds. Use the corporate account, Sterling yelled, his patience snapping. "I am the CEO of Hayes Harrington. The money is good." Graham looked at the audience, then back at Sterling. The theatricality of the moment was palpable. Graham wasn't just an auctioneer tonight. He was the executioner. "That brings us to the surprise lot I mentioned earlier," Graham said, his voice dropping an octave. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have one final item for auction tonight. It wasn't in your brochures." Sterling stood frozen in the middle of the aisle. The spotlight was still on him, blinding him. He felt exposed like an insect under a magnifying glass. "What is this?" Sterling hissed. "Sit down, Sterling," Sienna whispered frantically, tugging at his jacket. "Everyone is staring." "I won't sit down. The final lot," Graham continued, ignoring Sterling, "is not an object. It is a piece of information, or rather, a correction of the record." The screen behind the stage flickered to life again. But it wasn't a video of Madeline this time. It was a document, a PDF of a bank transfer. And then another document, a deed, and then a corporate filing. "Lot 100, Graham announced, is the immediate transfer of title for the penthouse at 432 Park Avenue, the Gulfstream G650 jet, and the controlling shares of Hayes Harrington Global." Sterling laughed. It was a manic, terrified sound. "You can't auction my company. I own 51%. "That is where you are mistaken, Mr. Hayes," Graham said. "You managed 51%, under the power of attorney granted by your wife." Graham paused. The silence was so heavy, it felt like it would crush Sterling's lungs. "However," Graham said, leaning into the microphone, "at 5:00 p.m. today, that power of attorney was revoked due to a breach of the moral turpitude clause in the Harrington Family Trust, a clause that triggers automatically upon the public misuse of company funds for extramarital activities." The room gasped collectively. Eyes darted from Sterling to Sienna in her red dress. She looked like she wanted to melt into the floor. "Furthermore," Graham continued, enjoying every syllable, "the bid for the Emerald $5 million was attempted on the Hayes Harrington corporate account. Since Mr. Hayes was removed as CEO 20 minutes ago, that transaction has been flagged as attempted embezzlement." "Lies!" Sterling screamed, lunging toward the stage. Two large security guards stepped out from the shadows, blocking his path. "I built that company. She's a housewife. She knows nothing." "And finally," Graham said, his voice booming over Sterling's protests, "the owner of the Emerald and the new owner of the assets previously held by Mr. Hayes would like to make the introduction herself." Sterling froze. "She's here." He turned around. The heavy double doors at the back of the ballroom, which had been closed all night, slowly swung open. The entrance was cinematic. The lights in the ballroom dimmed until only a single spotlight hit the open doors. Silhouette against the light of the hallway stood a woman. She wasn't wearing a beige cardigan. She wasn't knitting. She wasn't the meek, stuttering mouse Sterling had ignored for 15 years. Madeline Harrington walked into the room, wearing a black tuxedo suit Yves Saint Laurent, tailored to within an inch of its life. Her hair, usually pulled back in a messy bun, was loose, cascading in silver blonde waves. She wore no jewelry except for a simple wedding band on her right hand, her father's ring. She didn't walk with a shuffle. She strode. The clicking of her heels on the parquet floor echoed in the silence. The crowd parted for her like the Red Sea. Sterling watched her approach, his mouth slightly open. He couldn't process the image. This was his wife, but it wasn't his wife. The woman he knew was afraid of waiters. This woman looked like she owned the hotel. Madeline walked straight down the center aisle, past the gawking billionaires, past the gossip columnists who were frantically typing on their phones and stopped 5 feet from Sterling. She didn't look at him. She looked at Sienna. Sienna, who had been so confident an hour ago, shrank back. The red dress suddenly felt cheap. The diamonds felt heavy. "Hello, Sienna," Madeline said. Her voice was calm, melodic, and terrifyingly steady. "That's a lovely dress. My husband has excellent taste in gifts. Unfortunately, he has terrible taste in accounting." I didn't know," Sienna stammered, tears welling up. "He told me you were separated." "We are now," Madeline said dryly. She finally turned her eyes to Sterling. The look she gave him wasn't one of anger. It was one of absolute, crushing indifference. It was the look you give a cockroach before you step on it. "Madeline!" Sterling choked out. He tried to summon his bravado, his CEO charm. "Madeline, baby, listen. This is a misunderstanding, a stunt. We can talk about this at home." "Home?" Madeline raised an eyebrow. "You mean the penthouse? The locks were changed an hour ago. Your things are on the curb. Well, the things you bought with your own salary, which, let's be honest, wasn't much compared to what you spent." "You can't do this," Sterling hissed, stepping closer, trying to intimidate her with his height. "I am Hayes Harrington. You need me. The board will never back you. You don't know how to run a shipping empire." Madeline laughed. It was a genuine, dark laugh. "Sterling, you fool," she said loud enough for the nearby tables to hear. "Who do you think taught you who corrected your spreadsheets at night while you were sleeping? Who told you to buy into Rotterdam when you wanted to buy into unstable markets in South America? I ran the company through you. You were just the suit I sent to the meetings because I didn't want the headache." Sterling reeled back as if slapped. "And the board?" Madeline gestured to table 2, where the board of directors sat. They were all raising their glasses to her. "They've known for months. We were just waiting for you to make a mistake big enough to void your severance package." She pointed to the stage where the image of the emerald still glowed on the screen. "And you just made a $5 million mistake." Sterling looked around. The trap had snapped shut. He looked at Sebastian Cross, who was laughing. He looked at Clinton Vane, his lawyer, who was shrugging apologetically. "Clinton," Sterling pleaded. "Do something. I represent the company, Sterling," Clinton called out, "and the company is her." Sterling felt the floor tilting. He looked at Sienna, but she was already backing away, distancing herself from the blast radius. "Now," Madeline said, turning to the auctioneer on stage. "Graham, I believe the gentleman cannot pay for the item." "That appears to be the case, Mrs. Harrington," Graham said. "Then, as the underbidder, I believe the option falls to the floor," Madeline said. "But I don't want the emerald. It's a bit gaudy. I'll donate the $5 million directly to the children's wing." The room erupted in applause, a standing ovation. They were cheering for his destruction. "However," Madeline said, raising her hand to silence the room again, "there is one piece of business left. The police are waiting in the lobby, Sterling." "Police?" Sterling paled. "For what?" "A declined credit card isn't a crime, no," Madeline said, stepping in close, her voice a whisper that only he could hear. "But insider trading is, and tax evasion, and fraud. Remember those documents I reviewed while I was sick? I sent copies to the SEC and the FBI this morning." Sterling's knees gave out. He grabbed the back of a chair to steady himself. "You ruined me," he whispered. "Why I made you money. You humiliated me." Madeline said, her eyes cold as ice. "You brought her here, to my father's gala. You thought I was weak because I was quiet. You forgot the first rule of the shipping business, Sterling." "What?" he breathed. Ideally, she said, smoothing the lapel of his jacket. You never see the iceberg until it's too late. She turned her back on him. Officers. 2 uniformed NYPD officers and 2 agents in suits entered the ballroom. They weren't moving with urgency. They knew he wasn't going anywhere. Sterling looked at Sienna. Sienna, call my backup lawyer. Call Weiss. Sienna looked at the officers, then at Madeline. She took a deep breath. I think I'll take an Uber, Sienna said. She turned and walked out the side exit, leaving him alone. The officers reached him. Sterling Hayes, you're under arrest. As they handcuffed him, the flashbulbs went off again. But this time they weren't capturing a titan of industry. They were capturing a man crying in a tuxedo, while his ex-wife, stood center stage, accepting a glass of champagne from the auctioneer. To charity. Madeline toasted, raising her glass to the room. To Madeline, the room roared back. Sterling was dragged out his heels, scuffing the red carpet he had walked in on so proudly. But the story wasn't quite over. Because Madeline Harrington wasn't just interested in justice, she was interested in a complete purge. And there was one person left in the room who had helped Sterling hide the money, someone who thought they were safe in the shadows. Madeline's eyes scanned the room and landed on table 4. Sebastian Cross stopped smiling. The ballroom of the Plaza Hotel was buzzing with a frenetic energy that had nothing to do with charity and everything to do with witnessing a public execution. Sterling Hayes had been dragged out in handcuffs, his shouts echoing down the corridor. But the show wasn't over. The guests, initially shocked, were now voracious. They sensed that Madeline Harrington, the woman they had dismissed as a recluse, was clearing the board. Madeline stood on the stage, the spotlight reflecting off her platinum hair. She took a sip of champagne, her eyes fixed on table 4. Sebastian Cross, the corporate raider, with a reputation for stripping companies for parts, slowly stood up. He was a handsome man, in a serpentine way, with slicked-back dark hair and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. He had been Sterling's rival for years or so, the business pages reported. He buttoned his tuxedo jacket and walked toward the stage, clapping slowly. A slow, rhythmic applause that drew every eye in the room. "Bravo!" Sebastian called out, his voice smooth and projecting easily to the back of the room. "Truly bravo, Madeline. I haven't seen a performance like that since your father was alive. He would be proud." He stopped at the foot of the steps leading to the stage. He looked up at her, attempting to project an air of camaraderie. "It's a good thing you got rid of him," Sebastian continued, addressing the room as much as her. "Sterling was a leech. Weak. I've been trying to tell the board for years that Hayes Harrington needed new leadership. I'm glad to see you've finally come to your senses. I assume now that the dust has settled, we can discuss the acquisition offer I sent last week. It would stabilize the stock after tonight's unpleasantness." Madeline looked down at him. Her expression didn't change. She didn't smile. She didn't frown. She just watched him like a biologist studying a particularly interesting fungus. "Sebastian," she said, her voice amplified by the microphone, "you seem to be under the impression that I removed Sterling to make room for you." Sebastian chuckled, resting a foot on the bottom step. "Well, let's be realistic, my dear. The market hates uncertainty. With Sterling under arrest, the stock will tank by morning. You need a partner. Someone who knows the shipping lanes. Someone strong." "Strong," Madeline repeated. "Is that what you call it?" She signaled to the tech booth. The screen behind her, which had previously displayed the Emerald and Sterling's fraud, changed again. This time it wasn't a bank statement. It was a transcript of a chat log from an encrypted messaging app. The color drained from Sebastian's face so fast it looked like he'd been physically struck. "You see," Madeline told the audience walking to the edge of the stage. Sterling was a thief, yes, but he wasn't smart enough to hide $300 million on his own. He needed a washer. He needed someone with offshore infrastructure. Someone who could set up shell companies in Panama and the Seychelles. She pointed a manicured finger at Sebastian. He needed a rival to fight with publicly, to drive the stock price down so they could buy back shares cheaply through those shell companies. It's called a short and distort scheme, isn't it, Sebastian? The room gasped. This was bigger than a divorce. This was market manipulation on a massive scale. That's slander, Sebastian hissed, his charm evaporating. Turn that off. It's not slander if it's time-stamped, Madeline replied coolly. July 12th. You wrote to Sterling, keep the price under 40. I have the accounts ready in Cyprus. We bleed the wife dry, then we split the carcass. A murmur of disgust rippled through the crowd. These were wealthy people, ruthless in their own right, but there was an honor among thieves. Conspiring to defraud a spouse, and a Harrington at that, was a violation of the code. I didn't write that, Sebastian shouted, looking around for support. It's fake it, she's hysterical. My forensic analysts recovered it from Sterling's private server, Madeline said. The one he thought was secure because he paid your security firm to encrypt it. But here's the twist, Sebastian. You kept copies. You were planning to blackmail Sterling once the divorce was final, weren't you? Sebastian went silent. His mouth opened and closed. You underestimated me, Madeline said, her voice dropping to a dangerous register. You all did. You looked at a woman who preferred gardening to galas and assumed she was stupid. You assumed I wasn't reading the reports. You assumed I didn't know that my father's legacy was being carved up by vultures. She took another step forward. The FBI isn't just investigating Sterling, Sebastian. They've been monitoring your firm Cross Capital for 6 months. I gave them the key to your encryption 3 days ago. Sebastian looked toward the exit. The doors were still blocked by the security team. He realized with a jolt of terror that the police who had taken Sterling away hadn't left. 2 agents were waiting by the emergency exit, watching him. You set this whole night up, Sebastian whispered, looking up at her with a mix of hatred and awe. The auction, the invite. You knew we'd both be here. I like efficiency, Madeline said dryly. Why take out the trash in 2 trips when you can do it in 1? She turned to the crowd. Graham, please continue the auction. I believe the next item is a vintage wine collection. I'll start the bidding at 50,000. I feel like celebrating. As the auctioneer stammered to restart the proceedings, Sebastian Cross was quietly escorted out by federal agents. He didn't scream like Sterling. He went quietly, his head down, knowing the game was truly, irretrievably over. Madeline didn't watch him go. She sat down at table 1 alone and picked up a menu. For the first time in 15 years, she felt like she could breathe. But there was one loose thread remaining. Sienna Blake ran. She didn't wait for an Uber. She ran out the side door of the plaza onto 58th Street, her heels clicking frantically on the pavement. The humid night air hit her face, ruining her makeup. But she didn't care. Panic was a cold knot in her stomach. This wasn't supposed to happen. Sterling had promised her the world. He told her Madeline was a ghost, a nobody. He told her the prenup was ironclad. He told her the company was his. Idiot, she sobbed, hailing a cab. A yellow taxi screeched to a halt. Where to, lady? The driver asked, eyeing her expensive dress and tear-streaked face in the rear-view mirror. 432 Park Avenue, she said, her voice trembling. Just go. She needed to get to the apartment. Sterling had bought it for her 3 months ago, a penthouse suite. It was her sanctuary, her safety net. If Sterling was going to jail, she needed to grab the jewelry, the cash in the safe, and the deeds. She needed to liquidate before the freeze hit. She pulled out her phone. Missed calls from her mother. Missed calls from her friends who were watching the live streams. She ignored them all. She dialed Sterling, straight to voicemail. Damn it! She threw the phone onto the seat. The taxi wove through traffic, finally pulling up to the towering, pencil-thin skyscraper of 432 Park. It was one of the most expensive addresses in the world. Sienna threw a crumpled $100 bill at the driver and scrambled out. She rushed to the massive glass doors. Usually the doorman, a friendly guy named Eduardo, would open the door with a smile and say, "Good evening, Miss Blake." Tonight, the door didn't open. Sienna pulled on the handle. Locked. She waved at Eduardo through the glass. He was standing at the podium, looking down at a clipboard. He looked up, saw her, and his face hardened. He didn't move. "Eduardo!" she shouted, banging on the glass. "Let me in." "It's me." Eduardo pressed a button on the intercom. His voice came through the speaker, tinny and impersonal. "I cannot let you in, Miss Blake." "What are you talking about?" "I live here. Open the door." "Management has received a notice of trespass," Eduardo said, not making eye contact. "The leaseholder has revoked all guest privileges. The locks have been recoded." "Leaseholder," Sienna screamed. "Sterling bought this place. He owns it." "Mr. Hayes does not own this unit," Eduardo replied calmly. "The unit is owned by Harrington Trust Holdings. We received a call from the owner, Mrs. Madeline Hayes, 20 minutes ago. She informed us that you are no longer an authorized occupant." Sienna felt the sidewalk lurch beneath her. It was a company apartment. Sterling hadn't bought it for her. He had leased it through the company to avoid putting it in his name, probably to hide it from the IRS. And now that Madeline controlled the company... "My stuff is in there." Sienna pleaded, her anger turning to desperation. "My clothes, my jewelry, my dog." "Animal control picked up the dog 10 minutes ago," Eduardo said. "It's being taken to a luxury kennel. As for your personal effects, they have been boxed and placed in the service bay. You have 10 minutes to collect them before they are moved to the curb." "The curb?" Sienna gasped. "I'm wearing a $10,000 dress. You can't treat me like this." "I'm just following orders, Miss Blake. Please move away from the entrance. You are disturbing the residents." The intercom clicked off. Sienna stood there, the reflection of the city lights dancing in the glass that barred her from her life. She had nothing. Her credit cards were linked to Sterling's secondary accounts. Her car was a lease in the company name. Even the phone in her hand was paid for by Hayes Harrington Global. As if on cue, her phone buzzed. A text message from the service provider Service, suspended by account administrator. The bars in the corner of the screen went to 0. Sienna sank down onto the concrete planter outside the building. She buried her face in her hands. She was 24 years old. She had burned every bridge with her family to be with Sterling. She had quit her job. She had mocked her friends who worked 9 to 5s. And now she was homeless on Park Avenue. "Miss Blake," Sienna looked up. A black SUV had pulled up to the curb. The window rolled down. It wasn't the police. It was a woman in a sharp grey suit. Beatrice Kerr, Madeline's lawyer. "Who are you?" Sienna asked, wiping her eyes. "I'm Beatrice Kerr. I represent Madeline Harrington," the woman said. "Get in." "I'm not going anywhere with you." Sienna spat through the fight was leaving her. "She ruined my life." "Sterling ruined your life," Beatrice corrected sharply. "Madeline just turned the lights on. Now you can sit there and wait for the paparazzi. They're about 3 minutes away, by the way. Or you can get in the car and we can discuss your future, specifically whether that future involves a prison cell." Sienna froze. "Prison? I didn't do anything." "You accepted gifts purchased with embezzled funds," Beatrice recited. "You are listed as a consultant on the payroll of a shell company that laundered money. That makes you an accessory to fraud, money laundering, and grand larceny. The FBI is very interested in talking to you." Sienna looked down the street. She could see the flashing lights of press vans turning the corner. She opened the car door and got in. The interior of the SUV was cool and smelled of leather. Beatrice didn't look at her. She just signaled the driver to move. "Where are we going?" Sienna asked, her voice small. "To a secure location," Beatrice said, opening a file folder on her lap. "Here is the situation, Sienna. Madeline is a practical woman. She knows you were seduced by the lifestyle. She knows Sterling is a manipulator. She doesn't hate you. She pities you." Sienna bristled. Pity was worse than hate. "However," Beatrice continued, "Madeline needs the location of the safe deposit box Sterling opened in your name in Zurich. We know it exists. We know you have the key." Sienna clutched her purse. The small silver key was sewn into the lining. Sterling had told her never to use it unless he died. "I don't know what you're talking about," Sienna lied. Beatrice sighed. "Sienna, look at me." Sienna looked. Beatrice's eyes were hard. "Sterling is going to throw you under the bus," Beatrice said. "His lawyers are already drafting a statement claiming you were the mastermind, that you seduced him and forced him to embezzle the money. He will trade you for a reduced sentence in a heartbeat." Sienna felt sick. It sounded exactly like something Sterling would do. "Madeline is offering you a lifeline," Beatrice said. "Give us the key. Testify that Sterling gave it to you. Tell the truth about the consulting fees. If you cooperate, Madeline will decline to press charges regarding the company assets you misappropriated. She will also give you a one-way ticket to wherever you came from and enough cash to start over. A clean slate. And if I don't, then we drop you off at the nearest police precinct," Beatrice said, closing the folder. "And you can explain to the feds why you're holding the key to a box containing $40 million of stolen money." Sienna looked out the window. New York City passed by in a blur of lights. The city she thought she had conquered. The city that had chewed her up and spit her out in less than 4 hours. She reached into her purse. She ripped the lining. Her fingers brushed the cold metal of the key. She pulled it out and held it up. "He told me it was for our future," Sienna whispered, a tear sliding down her cheek. "He lied," Beatrice said, holding out her hand. Sienna dropped the key into Beatrice's palm. "Smart girl," Beatrice said. She tapped the partition. "Driver, take us to JFK, and then to the FBI field office." Sienna leaned back against the seat and closed her eyes. The drama was over. The high life was over. She was going back to Ohio, or wherever she could hide. But back at the Plaza Hotel, Madeline Harrington was just finishing her glass of champagne. She wasn't celebrating a victory. She was preparing for the reconstruction. She stood up from table 1 and walked toward the exit. The staff bowed as she passed. The guests parted with reverence. She walked out into the cool night air. The limo was waiting. "Home, Mrs. Harrington?" the driver asked. Madeline paused. She looked up at the skyline. "No, James," she said. "Take me to the office. I have a company to fix." She got in, and the door closed with a solid, final thud. The Queen had returned to her throne. The trial of Sterling Hayes was not the swift, clean affair his high-priced lawyers had promised. It was a slow, grinding dismantling of a man who had believed himself to be a god. It took place 6 months after the Gala in the Federal District Court of Southern New York. The media frenzy was unprecedented. They called it the Gala Gate scandal. Madeleine attended every single day. She didn't sit in the back. She sat in the front row directly behind the prosecution, dressed in impeccable, sober suits. She never spoke to the press. She never gave interviews. Her presence was enough. She was the silent witness, the anchor around Sterling's neck. Sterling looked terrible. The 6 months in remand had stripped him of his tan, his arrogance, and his veneer of youth. His hair was graying. He looked smaller. When Sienna took the stand, the courtroom was packed. She looked different too, dressed in a simple blouse and slacks, wearing glasses. She didn't look at Sterling. She told the jury everything. The fake consulting contracts, the private jet trips categorized as logistics surveys, the safe deposit box in Zurich. Sterling stared at her with hatred, but she held her ground. Beatrice Kerr had coached her well. Sienna wasn't the villain anymore. She was the foolish girl who got caught in the spider's web. But the final nail in the coffin wasn't Sienna. It was the audio recordings Madeleine had recovered. On day 10 of the trial, the prosecution played a recording from inside the Hayes, Connecticut home. It had been recorded by the smart home security system, a system Sterling had installed himself, forgetting that the administrator access was linked to the family email account, which Madeleine controlled. Tape plays Sterling's voice. "She's clueless, Sebastian. I'll have the assets stripped by Christmas. Then I'll dump her in a sanatorium if she complains. She's weak. She's nothing without her father's name." The jury looked at Madeleine. She sat stoically, her chin high. They looked back at Sterling. The disgust was palpable. The deliberation took less than 4 hours. Guilty. On all counts: wire fraud, embezzlement, securities fraud, conspiracy. The judge, a stern woman who had no patience for white-collar arrogance, sentenced Sterling Hayes to 25 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole for at least 20. As the bailiffs led him away, Sterling stopped. He turned to look at Madeleine. "I made you," he shouted, his voice cracking. "You were nothing before me." Madeleine stood up. The courtroom went silent. She didn't shout. She just looked at him with that same cool indifference she had worn at the plaza. "You didn't make me Sterling," she said, her voice clear. "You just woke me up." He was dragged out the side door, kicking and screaming. 1 year later, Madeleine stood in the boardroom of Harrington Global. She had removed the Hayes from the name and the signage within 24 hours of the arrest. The room was full of serious men and women, the new board of directors. The Q4 numbers are in, the CFO reported. Profits are up 15%. The new trade routes in Southeast Asia are outperforming expectations, and the charity wing has fully funded the new children's hospital. Madeleine nodded. She walked to the window. From here she could see the harbor. She could see the ships moving out to sea, carrying the lifeblood of the global economy. She had done it. She had saved the company. She had purged the rot. Sebastian Cross was serving 8 years for insider trading. Sienna was managing a small bookstore in Ohio, living a quiet life, forever scarred but wiser. Sterling was in a cell in upstate New York making license plates. Madeleine was alone. Yes. But she wasn't lonely. She touched the cool glass of the window. She had learned the hard way that kindness without strength is just an invitation for abuse. She would never be that naive girl again. She was the matriarch now. She was the storm that cleared the air. Her assistant, a bright young man fresh out of Harvard, knocked on the door. "Mrs. Harrington, the car is ready for the gala." Madeline smiled, a genuine smile. "Thank you, David. Is the auctioneer ready?" "Yes, ma'am. Same one as last year." "No," Madeline said, turning back to the room. "Get a new one. I don't like repeating the past." She picked up her purse, no longer the beige cardigan, but a sharp, powerful blazer, and walked out of the office. The world was hers. And this time she was keeping the receipt. And that is the story of how Sterling Hayes learned the most expensive lesson of his life: never mistake silence for weakness. Madeline Harrington didn't just get revenge. She got justice, and she did it with class. It's a reminder that sometimes the person holding the cards isn't the one making the most noise. Sterling thought he was the player, but he was just a pawn in Madeline's game. What did you think of Madeline's master plan? Would you have waited that long to strike, or would you have exploded sooner? Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story of high-stakes revenge, please hit that like button. It really helps the channel, and subscribe so you don't miss our next story. We drop new dramas every week. Thanks for watching, and remember, always check who actually owns the penthouse.